ask everyone to hit the mute button if they can, except for our speaker, who I will now introduce. Andrew Ross is a social activist and professor of social and cultural analysis at New York University. He is a contributor to The Guardian, The New York Times, The Nation, Art Forum, Jacobin, London Review of Books, and Al Jazeera. He is the author or editor of 25 books and more than 250 articles on a wide variety of topics: labor and work, urbanism, politics, technology, environmental justice, alternative economics, music, film, art, architecture, and poetry. He is a true Renaissance man. And he has turned his talents today to the housing market in the US. The blurb from his book says, through visceral frontline reporting from the motels and encampments dotting Central Florida, renowned social analyst Andrew Ross exposes the overlooked housing crisis sweeping America's suburbs and rural areas, where residents suffer ongoing trauma, poverty, and nihilism. As millions of renters face down evictions and foreclosures in the midst of the COVID-19 recession, Andrew Ross reveals how ineffective government planning, property market speculation, and poverty wages have combined to create this catastrophe. Urgent and incisive, Sunbelt Blues offers original insight into what is quickly becoming a full-blown national emergency. Andrew, I invite you to share your screen, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Serena. Are you able to hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. And thanks to FAU for hosting this, and also the American Planning Association Regional Councils. Thanks for coming today, showing up, everyone. I'm sorry we can't be in person, but these are our life and times. I'm in North Miami right now. And which usually I'm in New York City and Manhattan, so this is a much preferable location for me at this time of year. I don't think anyone who's on this webinar needs to be reminded, certainly in South Florida, that we're facing an affordable housing crisis. South Florida is number one, or very close to number one in the country, as the worst place for low-income households to find affordable housing. And this crisis existed before the pandemic, of course, and it was not just a national crisis, it's a global crisis. Very few parts of the world that are not affected. But something happened in the course of the pandemic that I think most of us would not have predicted, which is soaring housing prices and rents heading in the same direction. And in fact, last week I spent several days in a mobile home park in Pinellas County. And I found that mobile home units there were selling for or above the price that they were purchased for more than 20 years before. And that's quite an astonishing, reversal of the consensus around the depreciating value of the mobile home asset. That's just an indication of where we're at. And I'll also cite Zillow. If you think of Zillow as an authority these days, Zillow recently announced or declared that the average American renter was now cost burdened, which means they're paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And in addition, as Serena mentioned, this crisis is very fast becoming an emergency for a lot of folks who are facing down eviction. And currently, I don't think we have very accurate data nationwide on evictions, because that data is not collected by the federal government. So it's very difficult to piece it together. But anecdotally, we know that people are facing emergency conditions. So I'm going to share my screen, and because I brought along a PowerPoint, and this is my book cover, and Yeah, I mean, as I'm sure many of you know, there are many reasons for the housing crisis. I'm not going to go into them in any detail right now. I just listed a few here. There are also a lot of solutions out there that are being touted, and we can get to some of those. I think in the discussion time in Q&A, there are what I call market fixes, there are planning fixes, social fixes, non-market fixes, and then there's the housing justice movement, which is applying pressure from below. Um, I chose to do my field work and look at this national problem through the lens of Central Florida. And why was that? Well, first of all, I'm fairly familiar with the region. Secondly, at the time that I was doing my research, Central Florida actually was number one, worst place in the country to find affordable housing. Miami metros moved ahead of them. And lastly, most of the media coverage of the housing crisis has tended to focus on urban centers like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Miami, New York. And, you know, journalists, it's not that they're lazy, they're on short deadlines. That's where most journalists are, and they tend to report in their own backyards. But the fact is that the challenges, housing challenges, are much greater in many ways if you go beyond the urban fringe. And that is where poverty levels have been rising most rapidly over the last couple of decades or so. So I chose to look at Osceola County, which is the poorest county in Central Florida. It's one of the fastest growing counties in the US, has a majority Hispanic population now. And it serves as a kind of dormitory for service workers in the tourism and hospitality industry. And in particular, my field site was this corridor, Route 192, which is the main drag in the county. And Route 192 is a rather unlovely commercial strip. I mean, not untypical of many that you would find on the urban fringe across the country. It also has some, notable uh, vernacular architecture sites, if you like vernacular architecture. And there are basically six stops on Route 192 that I decided to focus on. And each of these are sort of, very local looks at the problem, but they also have national dimensions because you can find the same issues almost anywhere across the country. Uh, what I was doing my reporting, I lived in a lot of the budget motels on this strip, which is where increasingly people are spending long term as occupants in long term rentals and extended stays. I also spent a lot of time in the woods just off the strip where there are homeless encampments. And if the tenants or the occupants of the budget motels are somewhat invisible homeless population across the country, and there are millions of them living in motels in many locations. The tent encampments in the woods are even more invisible. And a lot of the media coverage of the crisis has been on tent encampments in center cities, of course, like Skid Row and Los Angeles. But if you know where to look, um, and the telltale signs of habitation, you can find tent encampments off suburban type strips again anywhere. Um, there's a chapter in my book about the high end town of Celebration and a battle with private equity firm in that town, which is again is typical of many communities across the country. I also report on the vacation home cluster at the west end of the county, which Osceola County markets itself as a vacation home um, capital of the world, has the biggest concentration of vacation homes anywhere. There's also a chapter that deals with the conflict over development of a new city at the eastern end of the county, which the Mormon Church is planning to develop, a city for 500,000 people. And then the last the last component of this is really looking at the impact of Disney World and Disney World wages on the housing market.
I'm so sorry, Andrew.
You can
We
hear me
just
now?
lost.
Yeah.
There it is.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, you just muted me. Here's just a map showing here's a vacation home cluster here. Here's the Disneyland Empire here. Here's the town of Celebration. It's going along Route 152 here. The motels are along this strip here, and then there are the tent encampments just off the strip here, just to give you a sense of the geography. More than 20 years ago, I lived in Celebration. I wrote a book about the fledgling challenges of the first wave of residents in Celebration. And I'm sure many of you know it's a kind of showpiece new urbanist town. And I promised my neighbors I would return after 20 years because every new town needs a chance to mature. And so 20 years later, I very dutifully went to town and checked in and started interviewing some of the residents who I knew, long-term residents, and very quickly found myself falling down the rabbit hole of small-town politics, which in Celebration is a very deep hole. And no one's ever quite sure who the White Rabbit is, other than Disney. And then I realized that I had some sort of obligation or responsibility to tell the story about the sale of the town center. The entire town center was sold by Disney to a private equity firm from Wall Street. And this firm had very little experience. It was only 2 years old and had very little experience in managing any kind of property. So there was a lot of mystery and rumors surrounding the sale. At any rate, they did what private equity has done in communities across the country, basically squeezed the place dry. They jacked up the rents. They drained off equity from refinancing, sold off pieces of the asset, and also did a very, very poor job of managing the property. So there's a lot of distressed. Lexan Capital is the name of the firm. There's a lot of distressed housing in the downtown condos. This is a mixed use environment with the condos above the stores. And I found a lot of condos in a considerably advanced state of distress. Again, this is not a story that's unfamiliar across the country. The difference in Celebration is, well, one difference is that the condo dwellers downtown fought back and waged a very long and ultimately successful legal battle with the Wall Street firm, which they got a settlement recently. It was a little different from the typical condo war in Florida. And the other unusual thing is private equity typically doesn't go after high-end communities. They tend to target low-end communities. And so Celebration was uncommon in that regard. While I was doing that reporting, I discovered that Celebration High School, remember this is a fairly affluent town, Celebration High School was enrolling the largest number of homeless students of any school in Florida. And this struck me as very interesting and worthy of investigation. So I followed the students outside of town and found many of them living with their families in these dilapidated budget motels on the strip. A lot of the families were multi-generational, along with household pets, and they're living in this one room. And many of them have been there for a long, long time. There's a very broad spectrum of occupants I found in the motels. Families in transition from foreclosures, a lot of low-wage tourist industry workers, including cast members who work for Disney. economic fugitives from the north, um, climate refugees from the Caribbean, elderly people, retirees living, trying to subsist on very thin government checks, a really broad swath of humanity in the motels, and a lot of folks working the informal economy, so people pushing relief from the pain and the hardship that many of the occupants are experiencing. So these motels had, and I'm sure many of you have seen the Florida Project, which is a pretty good film, give you a sense of the landscape there, because that is the location of the film. This is the Magic Castle, which is the main location in the film, one of my own sites. Um, Route 192 used to be the main approach road to Disney World if you're coming from the south or the east. And that's the reason why so many of these budget motels sprang up in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. They can no longer compete in the hospitality market, these exterior corridor type motels. And so the more and more the owners have been obviously looking to locals for long-term rentals. This corridor is usually very busy. It's very vibrant community that is generated when you have people living in the long term in those properties. And the owners, I should say a little bit about the owners. Obviously, they didn't go into business to become landlords, but they've become what I call reluctant landlords. And again, this is a nationwide phenomenon. They do a pretty good business from these long-term occupants who are basically tenants in all but name. They don't have tenants' rights, but they're basically tenants. And so the rates, the weekly rates or the monthly rates, are set just below local market rates for apartments. You don't pay utilities. You don't need first and last month's rent. And that makes all the difference for people. There are so many households that just don't have that sort of cash flow. They don't have that lump sum where they can put up front to get into an apartment. So that's the main reason why they end up in the motels. Um, it's not easy to evict in Osceola County. Um, the county sheriff has taken a position on Florida's eviction laws that the landlords don't really like, um, and so the owners really need to file. Deputies won't evict just because landlords call them. They have to go through this lengthy process, which is unusual. It's not the case in Orange County, just to the north, but it is in Osceola County. And one of the reasons for that is because the county officials tolerate the motels because they serve a lot of purposes. They're workforce housing, they're affordable housing, they are to some degree homeless housing. I'd say about half of the people that I talk to, consider themselves homeless, and others do not because of the stigma of homelessness. Um, so it's not easy to evict, but if you are evicted, chances are that your next neighbors are going to be in the woods, and they will include possums and alligators. And so I spent a whole summer visiting the tent encampments, and I learned a lot from doing so. Um, the camps are a lot of the camps are fairly well organized. They have self-elected leaders who some of them run a very tight ship, and they have rules. Many of them are organized by consumption. So there are heroin camps and meth camps and beer camps. And just for the record, I was offered a lot of beer in my visits, but no one offered me meth or heroin. And again, there's a very broad spectrum of people living in the camps. Folks who are fully employed, day laborers, you know, casual employees. There are people involved in the informal economy in all sorts of ways, whether through scavenging or panhandling, um, or, um, or pushing drugs in the drug economy. And then there's a sizable proportion of folks who, because of their addictions and our mental challenges, mental health challenges, are not able to, um, or are unemployable, basically. Um, so for the most part, the population out there is white, unlike urban homeless populations. And a lot of folks I found were people with rural backgrounds, and that meant that living outdoors was within their comfort zone to some degree. And some of them had been there for 10, 15 years, sometimes longer. So these are long-term occupants in the woods. And they often said that the idea of living within four walls wasn't something that they would feel all that comfortable with. It would be too claustrophobic for them. Charlie here, who I spent a good bit of time with, is one of the loners. These are outliers who don't necessarily want to live in a tent cluster. They don't want their neighbors to be too close. That's not to say Charlie's antisocial. He has a really good setup here um, in his compound. He has a flat screen TV, his solar panels at the back. He has a fridge, a sofa set. Um, he has his compound there with his guard dog in the middle. Not a very good guard dog, or at least not very alert. Um, he has a inflatable swimming pool for washing his clothes. There's a guest tent here, and other amenities. A lot of grills, and he retrofits bicycles or fixes up bicycles for a living. Um, Many of the folks, like Charlie, who are outliers, are house proud, so they keep their place really clean. This is Rachel, who sweeps her compound every day. And others are not so shipshape. They live in squalor, a lot of garbage, and they tend to be more nomadic. They move on fairly quickly, and the logistics of actually getting the garbage out of there is a challenge, and
So it did start at noon.
it's not in their interest. So
They're on slide 50.
now there's a lot more that I could say about the sense of community that's generated in those camps. But at its best, there are relationships that form and acts of camaraderie that develop that obviously wouldn't exist otherwise. Um, and I found at best the communities are based on principles of mutual aid. So there's a lot of sharing of information and resources and knowledge, sharing of opinions. People are very opinionated. And I don't mean to romanticize the community. There's also, a lot of predatory components of theft and physical assault. And especially for women, it's not the safest place to be. So they always usually attach themselves to a male when they first go into the woods. And most of the women are there are fleeing from domestic abuse themselves. Um, Interestingly, I found quite a few folks in the woods that summer suffering from terminal cancer. They'd given up on health care, and they wanted to live out the last days or months of their life in the woods where people wouldn't moralize about their conduct or their consumption choices. Um, so on any given night, while people like Charlie are, living under these live oak canopies, um, in a certain degree of hardship, depending on who they are and what their setup is like, there are thousands of rooms and hundreds of homes at the western end of the county in the vacation home cluster that are empty. And the starkest inequality in the county really is between those encampments and these very lavish homes in the vacation cluster. We're very familiar with this phenomenon in New York, of course. Um, Homeless shelters are overflowing while these luxury towers are going up, where overseas investors park their capital. Miami is the other place where in the U.S. where this really happens, and you can tell when the sun goes down, there are no lights on, in on most of the floors in these towers. They're not occupied at all. Um, and in Central Florida, the equivalent are the vacation homes. The overseas investors invest in these lavish vacation homes, and they really are very lavish and opulent. Um, McMansion doesn't quite cover it. There has to be another term for this kind of property, which I was not inventive enough to create. Um, some of them have a wide range of amenities inside, fairly extensive indoor theaters, basketball rinks, basketball courts, and bowling alleys, and immersion spaces for kids, elaborately themed bedrooms that are highly gendered. Um, I don't know what I feel like as a kid waking up to Dumbo right next to me, but I guess it's within their comfort zone. Um, and most of the time on this chapter, most of the time I spent um, following cleaning crews around. One of the few advantages to the local population of these vacation homes are the wages that are generated um, by the service crews, and they're fairly low wages, and the crews do commute fairly long distances. Unfortunately, it's not an upstairs downstairs kind of setup like the English country house. But there's a similar disparity, of course, in inequality. And the cleanliness standards are very high here. If you find so much as a candy wrapper beneath a cushion, um, the whole crew is called back in to do another cleaning. And these are back-to-back cleanings, so it can be quite punishing. Um, so I was not in a position to do the kind of study that has been done in many parts of the country, including in Miami, a study of how short-term rentals, when they reach a critical mass, what the impact is on local rents or on the local housing market. And most of these studies have shown that indeed there is a hike in rents in the neighborhood generally as a result of short-term rentals and also a displacement of populations. Plus, of course, the short-term rentals take off the market properties that otherwise would have been affordable housing. I wasn't able to do that, but I did find out that in interviewing builders and developers that they were kind of fatally attracted towards building this kind of product. I mean, for obvious reasons, they're very profitable. And so as a result, they were even less interested in building affordable housing, especially in the so-called, missing middle sector of the market, than they would have been otherwise. So even though the vacation home cluster is kind of set off from the rest of the residential areas in a way, and designated as a special zone, it does have an impact on the local housing market in all sorts of ways. So moving to the other end of the county, the eastern end of the county, we're in the eastern part of Central Florida, which is largely undeveloped, and it's environmentally fragile land and very valuable environmentally. A lot of very significant and important wildlife corridors run north and south down there. And so there's all sorts of reasons why, development of that portion is very contested. The Mormon Church owns a large amount of land. Mormon Church is now the biggest landowner in Florida, for those of you who don't know. And they basically waited until they had the chance to develop this land when the market opportunity was ripe, and when Osceola County was doing another comprehensive plan about 12 years ago. And so, yeah, please mute when you join us. Thank you. So this is the area here. The Mormon properties here is often called Mormon country by locals. And they have gotten approval plans to build the first phase of the development called Sunbridge, and that's already under construction. The second phase is this vast city of 500,000 people called North Ranch, at least provisionally. And one of the points, the contested points, and it's what I call the Battle of Split Oak Forest in the book. There's a chapter called the Battle of Split Oak. Is this relatively small nature reserve, 7,000 acres, which is supposed to be conserved in perpetuity according to Florida law. But the developer in, I would say, collusion with the county commissioners in Orange County and Osceola County want to put an extension of a parkway through the forest. And you can see why it's so important that you have these feeder routes for development in this area. And this leads directly to the airport. Environmental groups have pushed back and waged a very effective campaign so far in stopping the preferred route, which would have gone right through the forest. And this issue is still in the courts and is still being adjudicated, although Orange County recently revised its charter by commission to include conservation of this area forever, to reaffirm that it should be conserved. So the story I tell here is an important one about the urban growth boundary. As I'm sure you know, urban growth boundaries are one of the tools available to planners to help encourage or foster compact and sustainable housing. So effectively, you're not allowed to develop outside an urban growth boundary. However, as you probably know, in many jurisdictions and in almost every Florida county that has one, the boundary tends to be flexible. Why? Because large landowners who have land outside the boundary pressure local elected officials to extend the boundary to include their land so that they can sell it and have it developed. And this is exactly what's happened here in Osceola County. The original growth boundary was here. In 2012, the comprehensive plan was revised to include Sunbridge, make way for Sunbridge. And then in 2015, the boundary was extended all the way out to the Brevard County line to include North Ranch. And as a result, effectively undermined a lot of the efforts of planners and officials to try and contain development within this area. There's a lot of land, there's a lot of vacant land within Osceola County that could still be developed within the original growth boundary. There was no need to go out here except to obviously facilitate the plans and aspirations of the developer, the Mormon Church. So this is a classic case of collusion between officials and developer. Here's a blueprint for North Ranch, this new city, and as you can see, it's not all that compact. These are all small urban nodes along a sort of, the linear track of light rail. So it's not going to be very compact or sustainable. And there was a huge fight over which portions of the land were going to be conserved for the wildlife corridors. The Mormon Church didn't really um, understand or appreciate why they should have to give up so much of this site for environmental conservation. These are sand dunes on the Lake Wales Ridge, which some of you might know quite well. They're a reminder that this was really the first beach in Florida, as far inland. And with rising seas, which all of us are aware of, there's nothing really to stop penetration of seawater and salinization on that land in East Central Florida in the decades to come, as the waters might move further west. So the last part of this presentation is about the impact of Disney World. And as you know, this is the happiest place on earth. Um, Disney World is in the position. This is what I call the most successful land development venture in history. Disneyland is the largest single site employer in the country, and the site of secular pilgrimage for millions of Americans. Disney is in a position to regulate the wage floor in Central Florida. And as a result, the median wage in Orlando Metro is the lowest of any metro region in the country. And despite the fact that it's a union employer and there are union contracts there, um, wages are still pretty low. I decided to cover the campaign of the Disney unions for a $15 minimum wage, which was a successful campaign. A lot of folks thought it could not be done, and there's a lot of evidence that the success of that campaign had a major influence on the ballot provision from last year that was successfully voted on that put the $15 wage for Florida as a whole. I spend a lot of time in that chapter interviewing cast members about the discrepancy between the gratification that they get from being employees and working in the theme parks. And a lot of them spoke very expressively about the pleasure of working in the theme parks. At the same time, they do harbor quite a large degree of resentment that their wages simply can't cover the housing gap, and many of them living in cars or in the motels. And the $15 the wage hikes that are now taking some of them to $15 at the minimum level, it's still not enough, of course. In Osceola County, you need at least $19 an hour to afford a small studio apartment. And nationally, this is the case nationally. There's the $15 campaigns that have been successful nationally have generated hundreds of billions of dollars of wage gains in the aggregate, but they're still not enough to close this housing gap. So one of the questions that arises is, what responsibility does a Disney company have when it comes to the housing needs of its employees? What responsibility does any employer have? This is a question that has been asked most recently of big tech companies in California and Silicon Valley. Then they've rightly or wrongly been being blamed for rising rents in their backyard. And they have responded, each of them in turn. I mean, the big five Silicon Valley companies have all rolled out affordable housing campaigns, $1 billion, $2 billion campaigns. If you look very closely at the provisions in them, they're very long in PR and relatively short in outright philanthropy. But they are nonetheless responses and a mark of recognition on the part of the companies that they do have some responsibility no one expects the large service sector industry employers, by contrast, employers like Walmart or Disney, um, to accept that responsibility. And it's interesting to consider why that should be the case. Um, and indeed, if you look at Disney's record on affordable housing in the region, it's pretty dismal. They've taken advantage on several of occasions um, to profit from affordable housing programs from the state of Florida. And when they built Celebration itself, Celebration at the time needed, it was a development of regional impact. So as a DRI, it needed to include an affordable housing provision. But the company decided to donate a certain amount of money to mitigate the affordable housing challenges in the rest of the county, rather than build affordable housing on the site. They gave this money, and it was a pittance. It was $100,000 a year for 3 years, which really doesn't go very far at all. um, so the housing needs of these employees are met by this kind of linear dormitory, which is one of the ways I think about a place like Route 192. And it's in stark contrast to the history, if you cast your mind back, the history of company towns in America. There was a time when large employers built company towns. They were very compact. Some of them were very well designed, and some of them took advantage, of course, of employee wages. You had to shop at the company store in the town, so they recaptured their wages in a way that Disney recaptures its own worker wages. But at least there was some responsibility, a sense of a recognition of responsibility at that time that employers had towards their employees. This has gone askew and is no longer the case for employers like Disney. Although the unions right now are renegotiating contracts, and because labor is in a position of relative power right now nationally, which is unusual, they might be in a position to put housing on the table in contract negotiation. I mean, there's nothing to lose from doing so, and I think everyone recognizes that this is an acute problem. So just to conclude, because I want to leave quite a bit of time for discussion. I'm interested in a lot of your views and feedback. I, I I made an effort really to track all of the steps that Osceola County planners were making to use every tool in their kit to address the crisis. And they rolled out all sorts of programs in the several years I was doing this research, to encourage um, builders to come into the county, because there aren't any locally who do affordable housing, any of scale at least. They're mostly merchant builders, and offer them some sugar to get into the game of building affordable housing in the county. Uh, the biggest problem, however, is that authorities insist that whatever programs are put in place, they have to use the existing delivery system. They have to use market-based solutions, which are, as you know, uh, to offer a little more sugar to the builder to get into the game through subsidies. And if you look at the record, it really is fair to conclude that that delivery system has simply not worked. For several decades now, it has chronically failed to come up with products that meet the needs of not just lower income households, but increasingly, uh, this crisis has marched fairly far up into the middle class. One of the problems, as you know, is that Florida is one of the 27 states that has preemptive laws at the Tallahassee level, state level, which prohibit things like rent controls or inclusionary zoning and so on and so forth. So local officials and planners might have the best will in the world, but they can be, you know, overruled by these state level mandates. Um, at the very time that we need a comprehensive solution to the housing crisis, and I think that's what we need. You know, there are many different pieces and components to it, but a comprehensive solution is what the federal government's supposed to be in the business of providing, and has the power to do so. However, as we know, it's pretty gridlocked up there in Washington D.C. and and you know, even within the Democratic Party, it's proving very difficult to get movement that's effective. There was a recent Biden administration initiative that was rolled out on affordable housing, you know, a commitment to build 100,000 new affordable homes in the next few years. And as part of that provision, there was a commitment not to sell foreclosed homes to corporate investors. In other words, there was a big mistake that the Obama administration made after the housing crash, that basically opened the door for private equity to financialize housing. And instead, they're going to prioritize the sale of foreclosed homes to nonprofits and community developers and so on and so forth. So again, it's a baby step, but it's a step in the direction of of what is called social housing, which isn't a term that has a lot of currency in the U.S. It has more currency in Europe, but increasingly, I think, and I hope we're going to hear a lot more about social housing, which includes non-market alternatives for the most part. We hear a lot about restarting public housing programs on Capitol Hill now that the Faircloth Amendment's been repealed. And social housing, as many of you know, includes a lot of owner-occupier alternatives, community land trusts, limited equity cooperatives, and so on and so forth. Um, and I didn't go into this study really with a goal of emerging with a single recommendation. And the last chapter of my book does consider a lot of that policy terrain, but it's not really my expertise. I'm more of a reporter and an ethnographer. So a lot of the book really is devoted to reporting from the front lines about the human experience of these housing conditions. Uh, but I do walk away with the impression that unless we move quite rapidly in the direction of non-market alternatives wherever we can, uh, we're we're not going to see an end to this crisis. In fact, we're going to see prices continue to spiral higher and higher. So I'm going to end on that note and invite your comments and questions and feedback. Hand this over to Serena, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was fascinating and so much to think about. We do have several questions rolling in, and they also touch on the last few points that you were making. Two of them are about actually the logistics of living in, I assume these questions are about living outdoors. And they're asking where are folks getting their water, and is there any kind of crime control for folks who are living? I think these questions are directed to the out of doors housing.
Yeah, well, the the location of the encampments is pretty key. They're just off the strip for the most part. They do afford privacy. I mean, they're in thickets, fairly dense thickets of wood and forest. So they do afford privacy, but they're fairly near amenities. They're fairly near work opportunities, and especially near you know, low price retail outlets. So you know, you're going to find people bringing in large flagons of water from Walmarts or if you're lucky enough to be near a spigot that's outdoor, a water spigot, then I found a number of camps rely upon that. Um, when it comes to crime control, um, the police, the deputies in Osceola County, they're pretty much cognizant of where most of the campsites are. Um, they tend, I mean, they come looking for people who have warrants for sure, and if they're investigating narcotic activities, narcotic supply chains, they might come and raid the camps. Um, but for the most part, they won't evict again unless the owner of the land decides that they're going to develop the land, which happens quite regularly because of the location of the lots. Um, so the police are never that far away, and the residents tend to know who they are and have relationships with them. And as is the case with the motels, um, the county in general, because it's a heavily visited tourist landscape, they don't want homeless people on the streets. They don't want homeless people on the strip. They want them out of sight. So that's the reason why the county puts up with the lack of regulation of the motels, and also with the tent encampments. So they're not criminalized in a way that we've seen happen in cities, especially in the west of the U.S. Though there may be some cities in Florida that I know have moved in that direction.
Thank you. We have a question that's kind of on the opposite scale. This question is about affordable housing as seen as a problem of capitalism. However, it does also occur in other parts of the world, and capitalism is not a global phenomenon. So the question is, what do you see as the root problem when we see it across varying economic systems? What do you see as the affordable housing problem? What is the root of that problem across various economic systems?
Yeah, well, when I teach homeless housing and homelessness as a seminar at NYU, the first thing that the students read is Frederick Engel's text from 1883, The Housing Question. And there's a lot that's absolutely crystal clear in that text. And Engels really makes a case for how the housing crisis is a structural consequence of capitalist housing markets. It's always going to be with us, and indeed it always has been with us for low income communities. As I said earlier, um, they've always had these challenges in finding affordable housing. The difference is that in the last couple of decades or so, those challenges have moved further up the socioeconomic ladder. And for sure, I mean, one of the components here has been the entry of Wall Street into the housing market over the last 10 years or so. Um, I mean, commercial banks, of course, have always been involved in financing purchase of housing from the 1930s onwards. I mean, preferably through FHA-backed mortgages. That was a sort of, tidy and reliable return and a stable return. But Wall Street's interest in the housing market these days is much more speculative. And I think everyone thought that the the origin of this moment, and I mentioned it earlier, when the Obama administration decided to auction off these foreclosed homes to private equity firms, everyone thought that was going to be a short-term or short-lived financial play, and that when the housing prices rose, the houses would be sold and the firms would get out of the business. There was a moment around about 2016 when it looked as if that was about to happen, but it hasn't actually transpired that they've exited. In fact, quite the opposite. Um, Last year, the second and third quarter, 1 in 6 homes nationwide was purchased by corporate investors, and in some markets as many as 1 in 4. And it's not just housing, of course. Private equity has gone after all sorts of asset classes, uh, student housing, commercial real estate, mobile home parks now, um, and the like. And so there's really no question that I mean, we're talking about fractions of capital. Um, Wall Street's not a monolithic entity. There are different fractions of capital that are involved in investment, but the most hyper speculative has entered the housing market and has created this financialized situation. So it appears to be a different form of capitalism. Of course, it's not, but it's one that is certainly less conducive to meeting the needs. And increasingly, as you probably know, a lot of the housing that is purchased by the corporate investors is now purchased by algorithms. Humans are not involved in the purchases. They're not involved in analysis. These are done by mathematical equations, and so the renters um, have faceless entities as landlords, which is not a good situation for a renter to be in. But also, the houses are being snapped up by faceless entities. So this is a difference in degree, I would say, not a difference in kind, but a difference in degree from the conditions of a capitalist housing market that existed 20 years ago and before that.
Has there been any response at the state level in Florida to these issues? You mentioned that there are some um, measures in place that are kind of preventing local efforts. That's one state response. But is there any state level efforts to actually improve the affordability crisis?
Well, folks in this webinar would be better placed to answer that question than me. I'm a New Yorker, but from what I can gather, there's been a considerable structural reluctance to address the issue in Tallahassee, at least for the last 15 years or so, and 20 years, and that's during that time the Sadowski Fund monies have been swept and used for other purposes, and that's a major mechanism that the state has. There's a raft of other, subsidies that are available through the state, and of course there are federal low-income housing tax subsidies, but there are all, they're all basically ways, as I said earlier, of providing a little more sugar for private builders and developers to get into the game, and in many instances they carry sunset clauses so that rents in those properties are only really affordable for 15 years or so, and after that they revert to market rates, so they're not affordable in perpetuity. 10%. And that is
sun power up 6%, Enphase energy, solar energy up about 5% as well. Now, on a year-to-date basis,
I think someone needs to hit their mute button. Perhaps someone who just entered.
So those alternative energy and EV type stocks have been really volatile.
Thank you so much.
Stays that way, Kelly, this afternoon. Back over to you.
All right, Don, thank you very much. Story of the afternoon, very quickly becoming Peloton. The shares reopened after being halted twice. They're now down more than 20%.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and mute all for a moment. Oh, there we go. Okay. So this was a study that was based on Central Florida. You also mentioned some similarities to South Florida. What do you see the implications for this work on a national level?
Well, can you hear me? Yep. As I said, I do think a lot. I mean, some people will say, well, Osceola County is very, even planners in Osceola County say that we're unique. We don't compare ourselves to anywhere else. No one has an employer like Disney on its doorstep, and where that is true to some degree. Um, Walmart supercenters and Amazon warehouses and so on and so forth, you find that populations that live within the orbit of these large employers um, face similar issues. And really anywhere in the country that is a destination area for visitors in whatever form is going to have some version of this kind of crisis, where a lot of revenue is being sucked out of the local community by out-of-town investors, and and I think the footprint of the tourism and hospitality industry, which in the aggregate is the fifth largest industry in America, that is something these conditions that you would find, pretty much anywhere that's a destination area. As far as South Florida, Central Florida comparison goes, um, the one thing I would say in that regard is that, um, last night I did an event at Barry University, and we had a panel of housing advocates, um, a sort of loose coalition. The Housing Justice Coalition of Miami was represented on the panel. It's very impressive. There is absolutely no equivalent in Central Florida. There's very little in the way of affordable housing advocacy that's grassroots in nature, at least within civil society. And I would say that in most parts of the country, that is the case. The housing justice movement is not, it's very strong in certain cities, and New York is going gangbusters and has achieved quite a bit in terms of lobbying the state legislature. Um, but in most parts of the country, and especially in these locations beyond the urban fringe, there just aren't housing advocates or organizers on the ground who are there to put pressure on elected officials. They're not there to be partners or collaborators with planners who may want to be doing the right thing, but of course they work for the elected officials. And a lot of these elected officials come from the real estate industry themselves. This is certainly the case in Osceola County. I mean, that's their livelihood, and they have a vested interest personally in pushing back against any non-market alternatives that would threaten their business and their monopoly of housing delivery. And so I found when I was interviewing, people like that, elected officials, that trying to explain to them what a community land trust is, for example, um, there is, there's a certain level of recognition of what that might be, but I felt that there was very little interest or willpower in exploring it any further. That may be the case in more urbanized areas in South Florida. Uh, Folks on the call would be the better judge of that. But that to me was the biggest difference that I would put my finger on.
Yeah, it makes sense that there would be a kind of correlation between density of people and ability to activate or to organize. And I want to point out in the chat that there's a link. Thousand Friends of Florida is an organization that I did not realize is active in the affordable housing space. I think of them as an environmental protection advocates and so forth, but looks like they are collecting the legislative actions on their website. So folks have been posting questions about what's happening in Florida, might want to take a look at that website. I'd like to also point out at this time in the chat, I have the number for the AICP credits for this course. If you're looking to register for the credits for this course, go ahead and use that number or search for Andrew Ross or for the Treasure Coast section. Any of those ways will find you the course registration link on the APA website. So we have another question that just came in. This is great because we're thinking about a diversity of housing needs. What are your thoughts on the large upscale senior 55 plus housing communities? And do you believe they will have a similar impact that vacation housing has? And this person cites the villages as an example. Upscale housing, but it only creates low wage jobs. You kind of touched on that. There's people who service these homes. Those are some jobs, and some construction jobs come out of it. But what do you think about this, the senior housing communities phenomenon, and what impact will that have on the housing economy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't thought much about that. I mean, I came across a lot of folks in my reporting who couldn't afford to live in the villages or places like that. There was a different class and of people, and they had quite different challenges. Um, uh, but actually, before I go there, I want to say something about the previous point you raised, Serena, the Friends of Thousand Friends of Florida. I think that's an interesting development because environmental groups, and this is certainly the case in Central Florida, they're much more active than housing advocacy groups, and they're much better organized, and they have many more resources, have a lot of money. Um, chapters of Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, and so on and so forth. And I do think they're being drawn more and more into the housing sector, into the housing field, um, and partly because a lot of the initiatives for a lot of the anti-sprawl initiatives and the push for more compact and affordable housing has also become a sustainability initiative. Um, and so there's a sort of vested interest of a whole range of civil society groups in preventing leapfrog development, in containing development in compact compact formats, and so on and so forth. So I think we're seeing an increasing a sort of convergence of these two movements, the environmental movement and the housing movement, and hopefully that will continue and become much more powerful in a way. I don't really have much more to say, I think, about the senior the senior housing initiatives. I haven't really thought much about that at all.
Okay, thank you for that. We have another question about, we have many urban planners on the call. And what do you think specifically urban planners, what part do they play historically? Have they played, and what can they do in the future? You mentioned that there were urban growth boundaries, for example, in Osceola County. And so planners were thinking about compact and sustainable growth patterns, and these got kind of overwhelmed by other forces. So what can planners do? What responsibilities do they have? Had they had? Could you please comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult and fatal to generalize about planners, as you probably know, especially for someone like me. I teach a history of planning, but I'm obviously a great distance from the profession. Um, I mean, my sense is, and there's two books that I've written that really touch on this. Well, the two Florida books that I've written, and also a book I wrote about Phoenix several years ago called Bird on Fire: Lessons from the World's Least Sustainable City. And in all of these book projects, I did have the opportunity to interview and speak with planners and professionals in that field. And I mean, I get the impression that it is a very frustrating job, to say the least. Uh, there's there's certainly there's gratification involved in it, but the structural position of the planner, between local government, jurisdictional authority, and civil society is a very perilous one. And planners, most of the planners I meet and talk to, again, of the best will in the world, and they want to be doing the right thing, and they're frustrated perpetually by decisions that are made by the people above them. And there's limited leverage in that regard because their expertise is being listened to, and their advice is being consulted on. But ultimately the elected officials are they have their own interests, and those have to do with re-election, and sometimes these have to do with raising funds from real estate, the real estate industry, and from developers, and so on and so forth. So I thought Osceola County for me was a wonderful case study, and just seeing the collusion between the developer real estate community and elected officials, with planners caught somewhere in between. Unfortunately, I don't know whether that really resonates with folks on the call, but I expect some of you recognize that that sense of frustration.
We have an interesting comment in the chat here that local efforts to organize can sometimes go for kind of the good of lower income communities, but then sometimes they can kind of go for the good of upper income communities. In other words, NIMBYism, pressure, against more affordable housing being built. Do you look at that at all in the book? What are the pressures from other communities around these homeless communities? Influencing what happens with them, influencing whether affordable housing is being built?
Yeah, I mean, I think the story plays out as you would imagine it would. There's in Celebration, for example, which is the most affluent community in Osceola County. In fact, commercially the most successful residential venture in Central Florida over the years. There's a certain amount of awareness of the homeless crisis in the county, and indeed the local Presbyterian Community Church has been very important in funding the major homeless service provider, the Hope Community Center on Route 192. Without those funds, which were perceived as part of the mission of the church, Hope wouldn't have been able to do its work, and has done some wonderful work in the county. But of course, it's there's very little impact within the precincts of Celebration itself. It's not a gated community. Many folks believe that Celebration is. In fact, it runs quite counter to the ethos of the gated community. But nonetheless, there's very little awareness until the homeless students began to enroll in the high school. And I think that really brought home to a lot of parents that this crisis was on their doorstep. And in fact, that's what precipitated some of the funding for the Hope Center. But other than that, I think you would find that things play out along class lines, as one might imagine. And again, as far as the county is concerned, its main focus is on keeping homeless people off the streets. There are sweeps and a lot of arrests during high tourist season, and the jails are full, and then they get emptied out during a slow part of the tourist season, and that's quite a noticeable cycle.
It's interesting. I did read that in the first part of your book, you spoke about the number of high school students, not having a permanent residence, and the homeless crisis was really brought home to me when I found out that there are a number of homeless students at Florida Atlantic University. I would not have ever thought about that. This is just exactly like the working poor. There are people that that you come in contact with every day, and they just do not have a traditional permanent address. And once people start realizing that, perhaps that will help to push the issue. For anyone who is called in, there's just a wealth of information in the chat, which I'm afraid you're not privy to, but I will try to copy down the chat and put it with the recording of this session. A reminder to anyone who's on today who has a friend who was not able to get on because we did have a cap of 200 people. The recording will be available, and you'll be able to view that also for AICP credits after the fact if necessary. So I'm just scanning the chat. I think we've touched on all of the direct questions. If anyone has a last minute question, please enter it into the chat now. Otherwise, I would like to once again thank our partners. That was the Treasure Coast section of APA Florida. Thank you very much for providing the credits for this section. Also for the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, our great friends who partner on many of these webinars. Please watch out for a webinar on equity in transportation, details to be announced soon. That'll be happening later this semester. And as mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we are celebrating 50 years of CUES this year. So if you're not getting our newsletter, I'll put once again our email address in the chat. You can reach out to me at that address and get an invitation to all of those lovely things coming up. Okay. So there's a question in the chat. Andrew, could you explain the term missing middle? Because some of us on the call may know that and some may not be familiar.
Well, it is a term that's often used to designate housing that traditionally would have been more affordable. That would be multi-family, courtyard apartment housing, and so on and so forth. That is rarely built these days, or there's certainly been a decline in the building of it. Just in response to that last comment you made, Serena, about the homeless students at FAU, yes, you will find homeless students at all levels of education. And it's an interesting point because HUD, the federal definitions of homelessness are sometimes at odds with one another. Students are considered homeless, and there are services and subsidies available to them where their parents are not considered homeless under some definitions, and it's a very confusing map, I think designed to be confusing. But really, one of the few reliable estimates of the numbers of homeless people it draws on the ability of local education boards to extract that data from surveys done of students in their schools. And I think it's much more accurate than the point in time surveys that are done on any given night. On one given night in January all across the country, homeless service providers go out and try and do this count, and everyone recognizes that it's completely futile. It's a vastly undercounted population. And in fact, this year it was postponed because of cold weather in Central Florida. But subsidies and funds flow from these numbers, so they have to do these estimates anyway. But in education, at all levels of education, we're familiar with this population.
Yeah, we have more questions about specific policies and so forth. I'm not sure if you feel like that's the main thrust of your research. I know you're much more on the human aspect and out there in the field and talking to folks. There is a question about federal CDBG, so Community Development Block Grant, home program, subsidized housing. Are you aware of any of that flowing into Central Florida?
I'm aware of it, but again, it's not really. It's something that wasn't the main focus on the book. I really wanted to do this kind of reporting that was on the ground, and that's what my focus, my energies on. And my methodology is a kind of hybrid. I'm not trained as an ethnographer, but a lot of the methods I use are ethnographic. At the same time, I try and write as a journalist, as an investigative journalist would write. So it's a kind of hybrid form of a method that I call scholarly reporting. I'm not on a short deadline like most journalists, and I have the time to do that extensive interviewing and field work, and draw on scholarly resources. But I try to write in an accessible way, and I hope that some of you have a chance to read the book, would benefit from that.
Yeah, so you've mentioned a couple of your publications that might be of interest to urban planners. I'd like to give you the opportunity now to mention any other resources that might be interesting for urban planners that you've been involved with, any particular reporting you've done or books you've written. Are there other resources that we should be aware of?
It's a good question. It's a big question. You're asking me for a bibliography.
You've touched on a lot of different social issues. I've noticed there's quite a breadth to your reporting over the years.
Oh, yeah. As far as my writing goes, the best place to go is my website is andrewtross.com, and you can get a fuller sense of the books that I've written. Quite a number of them urban in nature, but I also write a lot about labor and work and environmental issues.
What's your next project?
Well, I just finished drafting a book called Cars and Jails, and it's about all of the ways in which car ownership and car use can lead to detention, and it's a kind of a spin-off from our prison education program at NYU, which I teach in, and it's based on interviews with formerly incarcerated students. And when we were doing these interviews, cars kept coming up as a regular topic. People wanted to talk about their cars, whether they were in prison, before prison, after prison, and that got our juices going. And myself and my co-author decided to write this book. So that's done, and will probably be out later this year.
Excellent. We'll keep our eyes open for that. And of course, get our hands on a copy of Sunbelt Blues, The Failure of American Housing. Thank you so very much, Andrew Ross, for your comments today. And thank you all of our participants and our partners for helping us make this webinar a reality today. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you, everyone, for coming on this show.